Hello, I'm Gary Kent. Pleased to be with you today. We're going to spend the next few hours talking about the 2021 ALTA NSPS Land Title Survey Standards, which will be going into effect here just in a couple of weeks. I want to point out a couple things as we get started. I'm going to be using several different documents to flip back and forth between. So on the recording here, you'll have to bear with me when I'll have to do some sharing of screens and stop sharing and switching. So bear with me on that. Also, because this is pre-recorded and I will be on live at the end of the program for questions. So if you have questions, keep those. And then when we're on live at the end, we can take those. So having said that, let's go ahead and get started here. And I need to, let's see, let's stop my share here. Get this up and make sure we're sharing properly. There we go. All right, here we are, February 4th. We are now in the 10th version of these standards. The first version, as you can see, 1962. I first got involved in 1988, so I've been directly involved with the standards for 32 years. I have chaired the committee since 1995. And I want to give you a little background on the update process. I like people to be informed about how this works and who's involved and such, so they don't have any misconceptions or misperceptions about how all this comes about. So there is a joint committee between ALTA and NSPS that works on the standards, and that is kind of the official committee that creates the final version, the final draft, that sends it, then approves it and sends it on to the organization. As I say, I've chaired that committee since 1995. This time around, on the survey side, we had myself as chair. We had Kurt Sumner, and Kurt's been involved with the standards almost as long as I have, and most of you know he's the executive director of NSPS. We had Judy Beal. Judy is a surveyor out of Virginia Beach. She works for Wolpert Engineering, or Wolpert, and she does a lot of land title surveys down there. So she's been a valuable contributor. We also had Todd Rackstad. Todd is a surveyor for the Salt River Project in Phoenix. He does land title surveys. The Salt River Project is a water and electric district, I believe, in the valley in Arizona. Todd does land title surveys on 1,000, 2,000 acre tracts, so he has a unique perspective. And then we also have Paul Byrne. And Paul is from Las Vegas. And if one of the casinos on the strip was being sold or refinanced, most likely Paul would be doing that survey. So he obviously has a unique perspective. So we have a really good cross section, both geographically and in practice on the survey side. On the title side, ALTA appoints probably about 10 people to that committee. I think at any given time, there's probably 6 or 7 who are actively involved. The committee met, I believe, 4 times, I think twice in person and twice remotely. In addition to that official committee, NSPS has a subcommittee on these standards that sits underneath the kind of the auspices of the NSPS Standards Committee. That subcommittee meets twice a year in conjunction with the NSPS meetings. This year, or I should say in 2020, we obviously did not meet either in the spring or the fall in person, but we did meet remotely in the spring. And now in the fall, we already had a final version. And so the committee did not meet. It was just a matter of the vote. But who was involved in that committee? Well, it's pretty much whoever shows up. And the last time we did meet in person, which was in the fall of 2019, we had about 30 surveyors there. In addition to all of those folks, I keep several email distribution lists because Outlook has a limit on how many people can actually be in a list. I think I have 6 email distributions that involve about 300 surveyors from around the country. And those people also had copies of everything and all the drafts and all the work that was being done, and had opportunity to contribute and comment on the drafts and make suggestions along the way also. So we had a tremendous number of surveyors and an awful lot of input on the survey side, which I think is very, very important. The process takes about 2 years. So we started back, I think probably in the fall of 2018, probably is when we actually got started. Maybe it was in the spring of 2019. Uh, I keep a list of suggestions, and that list comes about from 3 or 4 different ways. One of them is people email me and say, I think that you might want to think about this, or I have this problem with this. And I keep note of the questions that people raise where they had a problem or they were having trouble understanding something. But because if I get 2 or 3 of the same issue, I feel like, well, we thought it was clear, but maybe it's not. And so I would make a note on that, and we would relook at that. I also have people just emailing with suggestions. I have given presentations in probably every single state on these standards, I would guess. And when I do presentations, I keep track of the comments and the suggestions then too. In 2011, I believe we had 27 pages of suggestions. In 2016, we were down to about, I think, 12 pages. This time we had 12, 13, 14 pages. Again, I always think it's very important that people know I do not vet those suggestions. I do not look at a suggestion and say, well, that's not a very good one. I don't think I'll put it on the list. Every single suggestion I get is put on the list, so that both the Joint Committee and the NSPS subcommittee are kind of running in parallel, and they are looking at those suggestions and giving essentially a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Like the suggestion, that's a good one, we should consider, or not. That work goes in parallel. And this time around, there were no disagreements as to what was a good suggestion that should be taken in, and what was one that should not be taken in. Not that it was a bad suggestion, but an awful lot of suggestions we get really are business practice issues or contract issues. And as I kept track of how we dealt with every suggestion, I actually put a note into the document. So kind of for historical purposes, if somebody said, well, we had that suggestion, why didn't you do something with it? I can go back to the document and say, well, here was the reason that we didn't. Now, one of the things that came out of all of that was there were some suggestions that the committee felt, well, that's a good point. And that maybe is something we should clarify or provide some information on, but it's not something that necessarily belongs in the standards. And so I made a note on all of those suggestions, and it resulted in a set of frequently asked questions for 2021. And that document at the end of the program, I'll show you where that is, that you can find it, and I'll comment a little bit more about that. But that came out of that also. Now, as we go along today, I mentioned I'm going to be flipping back and forth between some documents. I have both a red line version of the 2016 standards, which I think has been provided to you all. The reason we do that is you also have the clean version. You have actually the official 2021 version, but it's hard to look at that clean version and know what changed, right? And so we use the red line version from 2016 to show the strikeouts from things that we removed, and to show underlines from the things that we added, so that it's patently clear what changes were made. So I think in the handout that has been made available to you, you have the red line version, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today. You have the clean version, which you can use, for your own purposes, sending to clients. You can even use it for Branding purposes, obviously you can't change them, but if you need to use them for educational purposes or company branding, you can do that. And then you also have the FAQs there. Again, most of the time we're going to spend in the red line version. But I want to get started by looking first at the structure. So in 2011, those of you who remember, we completely restructured the standards. They had been pretty much the same since 1962. I felt they were a little bit disjointed. They kind of bounced around, but they looked pretty much the same. And we had made a lot of incremental changes between 62 and 2011. But by 2011, I mentioned I had 27 pages of suggestions, and I was really having kind of some difficulty working in them, and we accepted a lot of those changes. And so I had proposed to the committees, I would like to just restructure this whole thing. Bear with me, give me a few weeks here. I'm going to restructure the whole thing into kind of a logical order of presentation, and everybody liked that, and so we have stuck with that. So we continue to have the structure we set out in 2011, which are the 8 sections and then table A. And we have made some significant changes to table A this time, as is often the case. We are going to go through the entire set of standards. Our focus is going to be on the changes, but we're going to go through the entire set of standards in these few hours, probably breezing through some of it, but I want to concentrate on the changes. The first thing, though, I want to start with is why we do a land title survey in the first place. And I want to spend some time here because I think it's very, very important. It's not only important for us, for the person signing the survey, but it's important for the person drafting it. And it's doubly important for the people out in the field. I think there's a misperception sometimes that a land title survey is simply a kind of a glorified boundary survey. And it is a boundary survey, but it certainly is more than just a glorified boundary survey. So let's spend some time here. Now, the reason that these standards exist is because we have title insurance and what goes along with title insurance. In the United States, we do not have a guarantee of title as they do in some countries. What we have is evidence of title, right? A deed does not prove I own property. It could be fraudulent, as an example. So how do we get around that? Well, what we used to have was an abstract of title, and we'd hire an attorney who would review that abstract and give an opinion as to kind of the efficacy of the title, what the burdens are, and so everybody's kind of on the same page as to what we're getting and what might the issues be. We have over the decades morphed over to title insurance, and nowadays we get confidence and continuity in our land tenure system through title insurance. Uh, that is the case all across the United States. There is one state, Iowa, where it is actually against the law, last I knew, and I don't think this has changed, against the law to sell title insurance within the state of Iowa, or for title companies at least to operate within the state of Iowa. Uh, Even though title insurance is routinely part of conveyances. They just have to buy it from an out-of-state company, which is a whole different issue over there. But everywhere else, it's title insurance, and that's how we are confident in our land tenure system. More specifically, what happens is that we have lenders who want a title policy, right? They are investing money in this property, essentially as collateral in a sense. Or I should say they're holding, they have a mortgage on the property as collateral for the money that they invested. And they want assurance that should the owner default on the mortgage and they end up um, foreclosing, that they know what they've got, that they're going to end up with property that is worth at least what they have invested by virtue of the mortgage. Now, one of the things in a normal title policy, there are exceptions, right? And we see these in the title commitment. And I'm going to talk about title commitments here in a few minutes, but we see in the title commitment, we look at Schedule B2, and it has the easements and the covenants and the servitudes that we need to be attentive to in conducting our survey. But there are also some standard exceptions that are written in the standard policy. There are 4 or 5 of them, and one of them is called the standard survey exception. And and I'm going to give you an example of that right here. And some of you have seen this, but this is every underwriter, probably even some agencies use their own wording here. But it says, as an example, rights or claims of parties in possession, boundary line disputes, overlaps, encroachments, any matters not shown by the public records, because the title company is responsible for what's in the public records, which would be disclosed by an accurate survey and inspection of the land described in Schedule A. That's an example of a standard survey exception, right? And in the context of that exception, the phrase accurate survey and inspection means a land title survey. That's what it means. So basically what they're saying is, we're not going to cover any of that stuff that we don't know about, right? Because what's the normal conveyance involves a seller who is a bank in San Francisco, a buyer who is some investor in Atlanta. The title insurance is being written out of Chicago. The seller's lender is in Seattle. I'm sorry, the seller's attorney is in Seattle. The buyer's attorney is in Nashville. Who of all of those people is ever going to see this property? None of them. None of them, right? And so they have this this exception that says we're not covering any of the stuff that we're not aware of on the property. Well, lenders will not allow this exception to be on their policy. Like, no, that's too much of a risk. We all know by some of the things we see on land title surveys, there's a tremendous number of things that can go wrong that nobody's going to know about unless there's a survey done, a land title survey, right? And so the lender says, too much risk to our investment to have this exception on our policy. We need that exception removed. Well, how do you get it removed? Well, honestly, and unfortunately, there are a couple different ways that can happen, but the most typical and the safest and cleanest way to get that exception removed is by a land title survey. So what happens is we conduct a land title survey, we provide that to the title company. They strike this blanket exception that says we're not covering anything that would have been shown by an accurate survey and inspection. They strike that exception, and then they study the survey, and they see things like, oh, look, the neighbor's fence is a foot over the line, and they write a specific exception for that. And many of you have seen this. It will say, essentially, we're taking exception to the neighbor's fence 1 foot over the west line as shown on the survey by Gary Kent, dated February 4, 2021. Or there's a manhole out there, and we look and we happen to see there's a sewer running through there, but there's actually no sewer easement. And so they will say we're taking exception to the sewer that's associated with this manhole out here because there's no written easement to support it being there. So it might be a prescriptive easement, right? And so they write these exceptions. Now, it's important to understand this isn't going on behind closed doors, right? Because the lender's interested in knowing what these problems are, and so is the buyer. So the title company strikes this standard exception, and then they write specific exceptions for the problems that they observe, that we observed and we showed on the survey. And then that commitment then goes out to the buyer and the lender, and everybody gets a copy, and they can then see what the problems are. Maybe they decide they don't want to buy it, or another thing, couple thing. Maybe they decide we need to mitigate this problem. The neighbor's got a driveway that's 2 feet over the line. They may ask us as a surveyor to write a description so they can convey an easement to that neighbor. Right. Well, now the driveway is still over the line, but it is no longer an encroachment. It's actually within an easement, right? And that gets rid of a problem. Now, one of the important things that can happen, and we'll talk more about this later, is that the lender may look at that. I mentioned the 1 foot, right? The neighbor's fence is a foot over the line. The title company writes an exception, and the lender may say, come on, that's ticky tack. We're buying 50 acres here. We want to develop it. There's not going to be any problem with that 1 foot fence. Just remove that as an exception, right? In other words, they're asking the title company to not take exception, right? Not say that we're not insuring that 1 foot. They want them to cross their fingers and hope nothing happens and remove that exception from the survey. And now you might ask yourself, why in the world would they do that? They know there's an encroachment. They know there might be a claim associated with that. Well, there's a couple reasons why they do that. Your normal title policy on residential property is not all that expensive when you look at the overall cost value of the property, right? If you buy a $300,000 house, your title policy probably costs, I don't know, $1,000 or maybe $2,000 or something in that realm. Commercial policies, however, are quite expensive. Right? So the premium on a commercial policy is maybe a lot of money. So the lender looks at that, and boy, they really would like to insure this property and get that premium, but they don't want to tick off the lender because they do a lot of work with this. So maybe it's Chase Bank. All right, we do a ton of work for Chase Bank. Well, if they ask us to remove this exception and we refuse to do it, they may walk. Back right after the recession in 2008, Wells Fargo was writing close to 1/3 of the mortgages in the United States. One bank was writing close to 1/3 of the mortgages. You understand how much power that gives them in the marketplace. And so if Wells Fargo says, hey, we'd like you to insure over that, and the title company says, yeah, I don't think so, well, they may just have a third of their business may just walk out the door. Title insurance is extremely competitive. And so that what the lender's saying is, I'll go down the street to another agency. I'll get them to do this. So that's one thing that can happen. The other thing that happens, and that's important to understand, is there are two policies typically. And one of them is the owner's policy. Now, this, in every state, people don't always get an owner's policy. They should. As a buyer, you want an owner's title policy. People sometimes think, I don't need one. It's no big deal. But you do, and you should get one. Lenders will not loan money. I mentioned this a minute ago. They won't loan money unless they have a lender's policy. Now, those two policies are different. The owner's policy puts the title company, as an owner, I'm into the title company for the full value of the property for as long as I own it. I mean, that's significant exposure to the lender. I'm sorry, to the title company. The lender's policy, however, the lender is only into the title company for the length of the loan. Now, on a commercial property, that might only be 7 years. The other thing is they're only into the title company for the value of the loan. And every year, of course, the loan's getting paid down. And so the exposure that the title company has under the lender's policy is dropping. And if they continue to own the property and they pay that loan off in 7 years, the lender's policy is gone. The title company has no exposure. So there's a couple considerations there. They look at it and they say, well, number one, I have less exposure from a practical standpoint because the value of the loan is maybe 80, 90% of the property. There has to be a pretty big problem that might be worth more than 10% of the value of the property. And the other thing is that lenders don't go get in arguments and sue the neighbor over a 2-inch fence encroachment that drags the title company into it. right? So the title company has less exposure under the lender's policy. So they are willing to do things for the lender sometimes that they would not do for the owner. So they might say, okay, we will remove that exception for that 1-foot fence encroachment. They may do that for the lender. They may not do it on the owner's policy. Why? Because they have less exposure. So when they do that, essentially what they're doing is crossing their fingers, pretending like they didn't see that problem and hoping nothing comes of it. Because if something does come of it, they don't have an exception for it. They're going to have to pay, right? So that's one thing that is important to know on the standard survey exception. Now, on commercial property, you provide the land title survey, they'll remove the standard survey exception. Uh, I want to discern that from residential property. On residential property, I want to take a step back and say there are 4 title underwriters that underwrite 90% of the title insurance in the United States. By rough numbers, Fidelity writes about, let's just say 40%, or underwrites about 40% of the title insurance. First American underwrites maybe 25, 30%. Old Republic and Stewart underwrite maybe 12, 15%. So whatever that adds up to, it's very, very close to 90%. None of them requires anything, no survey, no nothing, to remove the standard exception on residential property, right? In the title insurance world, properties fall into 2 categories: residential and everything else, which is generally called commercial. Uh, they've looked at the history of claims and the risk that they have under a residential property under the lender's policy, and they'll remove the standard survey exception on the lender's policy without anything, no survey, no nothing, which is why the old quote unquote mortgage survey has pretty much gone away in most places. They don't need anything. They will just remove that exception for the lender without anything. They won't for the buyer, right? For the owner's policy, we'll still have this exception on it. And pretty much you want to get that exception removed on your house, you'll pretty much have to provide them with a land title survey. Right? Now, commercial property is different, right? It's generally more valuable. They don't just remove the standard survey exception on a whim. Right? Now, I mentioned that that there are other ways besides a land title survey under certain conditions to get that standard survey exception removed. The safest, cleanest, most logical way is to provide that accurate survey and inspection. But there are other ways that it might be able to happen. If they have an old survey, they may be willing to rely on that survey in conjunction with an owner's affidavit, where the owner signs an affidavit that says, hey, nothing has changed on this property since that survey was done, right? Well, there's a number of problems with that, and we all experience that. Number one, the owner has no idea what they're signing, uh, and and um, and number two, many of you have had this happen, or someone calls you and they say, hey, I got this old survey you did, 10 years ago, and I can't read it very well. Can you just send me another copy? I just talked to a surveyor in Indiana here about this just yesterday. He said, I do it all the time. He goes, somebody just asked me for one that was 21 years old. I dug it out and I gave it to him. You got to understand what's going on. There are no innocent requests for copies of an old survey. There just aren't. What they're going to do is they're going to use that survey in a new conveyance. Now, if your state has a statute of repose, which Indiana does, I don't recall if Illinois does, but it's different from a statute of limitations. A statute of limitations uh, limits claims against, we're talking about surveyors here. So let's just say it limits a claim against a surveyor, but it usually has a cause of action, which is discovery, right? Indiana has a statute of limitations. It's 2 years from discovery, which means if they discover the problem 20 years from now, they still have 2 years to sue you. A statute of repose shuts the door on that, right? And Indiana's is 10 years. So after 10 years, I have no more liability. Um, I'm not sure. I'd have to talk to some attorneys who are knowledgeable about this. I'm not sure, but if giving a copy of a survey to someone might restart the statute of limitations again or the statute of repose. But certainly, if I give a copy of that survey within the time frame. So in Indiana, we have a statute of repose, it's 10 years. I did the survey, I certified it to the buyer, maybe the seller, of course, also relies on it. So I'm probably liable to them, even though I didn't certify to them. I'm certainly liable to the lender. I'm certainly liable to the title company. But and what the common law says, I'm pretty much liable to anyone that I might reasonably expect would rely on that survey. That might or might not include future owners, but certainly if I give a copy of an old survey to someone, knowing that they're going to use it in a new conveyance, I don't think I'm no attorney, but I don't think there's any question I am now liable to those people. So what's happening is they want a copy of a survey. They're going to use it in a new conveyance, and you are taking on liability or potentially taking on liability by just giving them a copy of the survey. Right? So I say there's no innocent request like that. And surveyors need to know or need to decide, how are you going to respond to requests like that? Maybe if it's a regular client, you do. If it's somebody you don't know, maybe you don't want to, maybe you want to charge something for it. Hand in hand with that is the request I know that many of you have had, which is you did this survey 5 years ago. I want you to, I'd like you to change the parties, right? So it was First American and Chase Bank and the ABC Corporation. That's who you certified to. We want you to certify now to Wells Fargo and Old Republic Title and the PDQ Corporation. We don't need you to update it. We just need you to put those parties on there. And of course, what they're going to want to do is pay you $100 for doing that. You understand what's going on is you are now taking on new liability. You now have 3 new parties that you were not liable to previously. So that's just a similar type of request. And again, you want to decide how you're going to deal with this sort of thing. I know some surveyors will say they just won't do it. Either order an update or you don't get a copy. We don't make that change, period. And many of you know I despise the term update, because there is no such thing. When you do a quote unquote update, you are certifying that those are the current conditions on the property. So it's a new land title survey. An update is a new land title survey. The only difference is I happen to have done it before. But understand, if the standards changed, you have to now make sure it meets all the current standards. You have to check the adjoiners. You have to check the monuments if you set them. You certainly have to do a pretty thorough check of the property to make sure any of the things that are in the standards haven't been impacted, so that you can honestly and in conjunction, in accordance with the law of your state, sign that those are in fact the current conditions on the property. So I know people who say, I'm not going to change the parties unless you order an update. I actually talked to somebody who said, I'll do it without doing an update, but I charge them the fee that I would have charged to update it, just to change the parties, because they're figuring I've got all that new liability anyway. So I think that's something that each person needs to decide, how am I going to deal with requests like this? But the main point I want to make is that there is new liability being introduced. Certainly, if it falls within the period of a statute of repose, or if you don't have a statute of repose, you are absolutely taking on new liability. Again, I'm not an attorney, but you could certainly talk to your attorney or talk to your professional liability carrier about this sort of thing. So, so those are some of the other ways that they can get that standard survey exception removed without a land title survey. I prefer it be a land title survey. A lot of attorneys are like, yeah, I know I can get it done that way, but I would rather have a current survey so I know what's going on with the property on behalf of my client. Uh, but it's the lenders who really don't care, right? The lenders just want that survey exception removed. They don't care how they get it removed. They don't care if they stand on their head in a corner and that gets it done. All they know is they got their policy and the exception's not on there, so they don't care how it happens. It's probably the buyer's attorney that would be most concerned about really wanting a good land title survey because their buyer has hired them to represent them, and if something goes wrong, they're going to be looking at that attorney. So that's just some background on that. I want to point out a couple other things here. Sometimes you may have wondered, so what's the difference? What's a title commitment or a title binder, some places call it, versus a title policy, or even versus a pro forma? Why do we even have all of this stuff? Well, here's the problem. I want to buy this piece of property, but I can't buy it without the loan. And the bank is not going to give me the loan unless they have title insurance. And I can't get title insurance unless I own the property. So we have this vicious circle. How do we resolve that problem? The way we resolve it is with a title commitment, which is an offer to issue a title policy, right? So what happens is I can't get the policy, but if the title company can say to the lender, here's what the policy is going to look like, right? Then the lender is going to be willing to come to the table, right? So what a title commitment does is it says, it's an offer. We will issue a policy to these people for this amount of money on this piece of property under certain conditions. Condition one is there are going to be some exceptions, right? And those are listed in Schedule B2. They go through the public records and they see that there's a year and a half worth of property taxes haven't been paid. So they write an exception, right? We'll insure this property, but somebody's got to pay off these overdue taxes. And by the way, we also saw that there is a neighbor has a 50-foot access easement across the property, and there's this 10-foot gas line easement, and there's a 5-foot electric line easement. We're not insuring those easements, right? Those are interests that someone else owns. So we'll insure fee simple absolute, but not as to those easements because somebody else has those easements, right? And there will be some other exceptions that will be in Schedule B2. So they say, we'll insure this amount of money to these people on this property with these exceptions if certain things happen. That's what's listed in Schedule B1. Now, we as surveyors never even look at Schedule B1 because we're not interested in it. But if you were to look at B1, it lists the things that need to happen before a policy gets issued. And it'll say things like, we need a warranty deed from the seller. And oh, by the way, if the seller is a corporation, we need a copy of the minutes of the corporation authorizing the sale of the property. And somebody, a guy fixed the roof and he never got paid. So there's a lien on it. We need to see that lien's paid off. And the seller had a mortgage on the property. We need to make sure that seller's mortgage gets paid off, because if it isn't, it's senior to the new mortgage, right? And so there's all these conditions that need to happen, and those happen at closing. So what the commitment does is it provides a framework, the assurance that gets everybody to the closing table so that all these things can get taken care of, right? We sign the deed and we pay the taxes and we pay off the guy with the lien and all of that stuff. So that's what happens at closing. So that's the function of a title commitment, is that it outlines an offer to provide title insurance under certain conditions, and those conditions get met at closing typically, right? Now, sometimes people ask about a pro forma. What is that? Well, the title commitment is not what the final policy is going to look like, right? Because title commitment has Schedule B1, says all these things are going to happen. And assuming all those things happen, they're no longer going to be conditions on the policy because they got taken care of. So a lot of times the lenders and maybe even the buyer's attorney says, I want to see what my final policy will look like. When you issue it, I want to know what it's going to look like. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll take the title commitment and literally take a pen and say, okay, well, section B1 is going to get taken care of. So there's a big line stricken through that. And maybe the lender said, come on, get rid of that exception you wrote for that 1-foot fence encroachment. And so they'll strike through that Schedule B2 exception for the fence, and they'll say removed. And what they do is they mark up the commitment so that if you accounted for all of the stuff that's marked out, that's what would appear in the final policy, right? And that's called a pro forma. And I sometimes surveyors will say, can I do a survey based on a pro forma? Sure, you can. Right? You can do a survey based on any kind of title work that is satisfactory to the parties that are involved. Let's see. I just want to wrap this up, this discussion with two things probably. I mentioned what a title commitment is. I want to point out what it is not. Right? And what it is not is a representation as to the condition of the title. In other words, it's not an abstract of title. Right? And you might say, well, how can that be? I mean, Schedule B2 lists all the easements, right? No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Um, I have seen situations where there's a very old easement on the property. Maybe it's a water line easement, and it dates back to the 20s, and the company that owned the easement isn't even in existence anymore, and they have trouble trying to figure out even who might own the easement. There's no water line in there. There maybe has never been a water line there, but the title company found the easement in their search, and so they wrote an exception for it. And it goes through the middle of the property, and the lender looks at it and they say, hey, we're loaning money to develop this property, and if you got that easement going right through the middle of it, we can't develop it. We're going to have a problem, and it's an old easement, so just insure over it, right? In other words, pretend like you didn't see that and just take it off of Schedule B2 as an exception. And the lender may very well do that. I talked a little bit about this a few minutes ago. They may look at it and say, yeah, what are the chances somebody come along on this easement that's 100 years old and they actually want to put a water line in, and now they can't because somebody's built a building there and we're going to have to pay the damages. And they look at it and say, yeah, that's probably not going to happen. Not only that, if they do that on the lender's policy, right, well, the chances are pretty slim that they will end up with a significant risk. So they will close their eyes and they'll cross their fingers and they'll remove that easement off of the policy and hope nothing happens. Right? So my point is that Schedule B2 in a case like that is not an abstracted title because there's actually a valid easement out there that's not listed in Schedule B2. Now, what do we do about that? We're going to talk about that later because that's a change we put into the standards this time to help surveyors decide what do we do when that situation exists. The last thing I want to say about title insurance is what you get with it, right? What you get with title insurance is two things. You get a duty to defend your title. If someone makes a claim against your title, under the policy, the title company will need to provide the defense for that claim. Now, if the claim is not something they can defend, I've told the story, my daughter owns and son-in-law own property in Southern California, and it turned out that there was a recorded easement, a recorded sanitary sewer easement to the city going right through the middle of their backyard, and it was not listed on the title policy. Well, they can't defend that, right? There's no defending that because it's a valid easement. They just missed it. So they either provide the defense for a claim or they indemnify. And in my daughter's case, they had to pay them the value that easement detracted from their property, right? So those are the two things that you get. And I mentioned that as an owner, you always want to have title insurance, right? It's the lender who requires it. And I've had people say, no, I'm paying cash. I don't need title insurance, right? I'll tell you, if you ever need title insurance, it's when you're paying cash. Because think about this. If you have a mortgage and they've invested 80-90% of the value of the property. Let's just say, and this absolutely does happen. Let's just say that it turns out that somewhere in the chain of title there was a fraudulent deed, and it turns out that you actually don't own the property. Well, what's going to happen? Well, the lender is going to get made whole, right? They loan, it's a $200,000 property and they put $180,000 into the loan. They're going to get made whole because the title company is going to have to indemnify them, right? There's no defending that, right? Because it's in the public record. They just didn't catch it. There was some kind of fraudulent deed, and they're going to have to pay the lender their $180,000 back, right? What about you? Well, you made the decision not to get title insurance. You're out $20,000. It's not the end of the world, but you're going to have to move out. And, yeah, it's painful, but it's not the end of the world. What if there was no mortgage? What if you paid cash for that property? And then it turns out you don't own it. And people think I'm crazy, but there is a ton of fraud going on in the land transaction world these days. I belong to ALTA. Every publication that I get from them, I get emails once or twice a day updating me. I get their monthly publication. They are chock full of information about fraudulent schemes going on. So it does happen that people end up not owning the property. And if I didn't have a mortgage, if I invested my whole savings into that, guess what? There is nobody to make me whole, right? All of my belongings are going to look good out there on the sidewalk because there ain't anybody I can look at, right? Title insurance is different from every other type of insurance, right? You pay your health insurance twice a month. You pay your homeowners once a year. You pay your auto insurance maybe every quarter. How often do you pay your title insurance? Oh, yeah, only once. Um, and it's not much compared to the value of the property, and it covers you for as long as you own it. And I'm telling you, there are things go wrong. Um, my daughter is a perfect example. Uh, so that's why you want a policy, and they do. Title companies literally pay hundreds of millions of dollars of claims every quarter. That's no exaggeration. I see the numbers every time. So that's what I want to say. And I think it's very, very important to have that background again, because uh, again, we're going to do a better job of preparing the land title survey. Our field people are going to do a better job of collecting data in the field. Our clients are going to be happier. The title company is going to be happier. Everybody's going to be happier, and the deal's going to close, and we're going to get paid. Right? So I just think it's so important to have that background, um, and that's section 1 in the purpose, right? Now, we're not looking at it, but the last part of section 1 has this little piece in there that we put in several versions ago, and there was a very specific reason that we put this in there. There are people out there, there were at the time, and there still are today, I know for a fact, doing what I would call fraudulent land title surveys. One of the schemes that's out there is people will draw up a deed plot. Maybe they'll pull it off of a GIS or something, and they'll go out in the field and they'll collect data, and they'll just overlay that onto a plot of the deed. So they're actually not doing a boundary survey, but they are presenting this as a land title survey. and the buyer or the lender may not even understand that it's not. And so back here a few versions ago, we said, let's be very specific about what it takes to be a land title survey, right? You have to do the field work that's in section 5. You have to prepare the drawing pursuant to section 6. You have to include the table A items that were negotiated with the client. And you have to have the certification in section 7, not some other certification, that certification. And part of the section 6 part is that I have to have some type of title work. Right? So those things are a must if you're doing a land title survey. Okay, I think we've gone about 50 minutes, and we're going to do this program in chunks of 50 minutes, and we will take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do another 50 minutes, and then we'll wrap up after we've got our 4 credit hours in. So I'm going to stop now for 10 minutes, and we will be back shortly.